I had a topic, doesn't mean I looked at it. I bought the book for the topic, boy, and looked at the details. I'm like, holy shit, these people want me to lose my clinic. Guru Nation, first of all, Happy New Year. I mean, wow. This is the first professionally shot video I've done in 2025. Thanks to Daniel Studio, and you're going to see him at SOS. You do know you're going to be on a panel at SOS, right? Like, you and me are on a panel.
Oh, really?
No, yeah, it's not a joke.
It's done deal?
Yeah. So you're going to actually have to take a break and get on the stage, too.
I'll be on.
We'll be on SOS, Save Our Sites. Listen, one of the topics that I keep getting requests on is ethics in clinical research, particularly taking a deep dive into ethics. And maybe it's perfect timing because this last year, preparing to be a father. By the time you're watching this video, as crazy as it sounds, I probably will already be, God willing. I've been reading lots of philosophy, and maybe it prepared me to make a better video, but there are two books that I'm kind of relating to this video that I'm going to reference from time to time. So one is Friedrich Nietzsche, and this is the last book he wrote called Ecce Homo. It's kind of his autobiography, but it's also like very like satirical. Right before, like weeks before his final collapse into madness, he set out to compose his autobiography, and it's one of his most intriguing yet bizarre examples of the genre ever written in his own style. But there's a lot of ethics, like for those that read Nietzsche. I do recommend this book. Links to both of these books are underneath, by the way. I get nothing out of it. It's not my Amazon, whatever. And then the other one's called Plato, The Last Days of Socrates. And this is probably even more appropriate for like this topic. But honestly, there's tons. I would say start with Plato because it's one of the first, like oldest, first person perspectives of ethics and philosophy in general. So clearly everyone watching understands the importance of ethics in clinical research. And you can extend this to ethics in healthcare, ethics in life sciences, and then ethics in business, and then ethics in being a human being. But we're going to stick to the narrow scope of clinical research. And, let me tell you a powerful quote from Nietzsche's book, Nietzsche's autobiography, Ecce Homo. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And this ties into this greater concept of having extrinsic values external to like your immediate goals. So a lot of people, and there's a lot of levers in this industry, and this is where we get into ethics, incentives. Clearly, there's a lot of incentives. Charlie Munger, I think everyone should get that book as well. I talk about it a lot on my podcast, Poor Charlie's Almanac. He says, if you show me the incentives, I can show you the result. And I do think that's pretty appropriate for our industry, and really for any industry. But Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. So understanding your greater why are you even in research? Like at the end of the day, I know most people in this industry are graded on whether you're an employee. In a CRA, you're graded on how many days on site. If you're a site, you're graded on how many patients did you enroll. If you're an academic, you're graded on your peer-reviewed journal or your investigator-initiated trial, how it did. Those are all incentives. Like if you do well on those things and all the KPIs, you can basically mention any KPI in the space, key performance indicator. We all have an incentive to hit our numbers, right? But I think really we should look for, and what Nietzsche is saying here, if we look for why we're doing what we're doing, we could bear almost any how. Because the how of getting your metrics accomplished is not always fun. And it's a lot of day-to-day nitty-gritty stuff. And this is where ethical dilemmas actually come into play. And then Socrates, in his book, says, in this book, The Last Days of Socrates, or Plato says in his book, The Last Days of Socrates, because Socrates never wrote any books. Plato, we know about Socrates due to Plato's writings. Plato says the unexamined life is not worth living. And so we do have to understand ourselves, and we have to know ourselves. To thine own self be true. Even though we know there's KPIs and we're all judged on them, we have to understand each of us our bigger why. And when you find yourself in a situation where consistently your bigger why is being compromised for the smaller KPIs, you're not in alignment, and it's going to lead to things like mental burnout, exhaustion, depression, unhappiness. I did a 2-hour-long podcast with Jess Thompson on this topic. So your personal values, external to your own KPIs, just what's the bigger goal for doing research for you, right? And there's a lot, that should be bigger, and that should be, for the most part, in alignment with how you're being graded as far as key performance indicators. Now, I say for the most part because we don't live in a perfect world, and this is why the question of ethics comes up. But you don't want to get into a position where you have to constantly compromise your greater values for your key performance indicators. And there's a need, clearly, for ethical guidelines in research. We can get into historical context of unethical practices. So, Tuskegee syphilis study, Nazi experiments during World War II. I mean, these are two of the reasons why we even have IRBs, which are institutional review boards. Now, the greater ethical dilemma with IRBs, because we have been discussing incentives, the ethics committees, and I'm talking about the large central IRBs, like WCG, Advara, I mean, those are like the ones that have 85% or more of the market share. These large central IRBs, which are ethics committees, they're private companies. They are owned by hedge funds. They get into the business aspects of research, and not just some of the business aspects, a lot of the business aspects, including owning sites, including being in study brokerage businesses, negotiating budget business. I mean, they do like patient reported outcomes, creating the technology there. So and I'm not saying I'm against that, and I'm not saying it's unethical, because I think they are able to prove and document, or at least justify, how they keep these conflicts of interests separated in order to do their macro job of protecting patients from unnecessary risks. At the end of the day, that is what an IRB needs to do, is protect patients from unnecessary risk, and that is what sites should do vis-a-vis their principal investigators. Sites and IRBs are responsible for making sure no unnecessary harm is done to patients. That's the foundation of our industry. Now, there's a lot of boundaries, and there's a lot of gray area, and the regulator of our space in our country, it's the Food and Drug Administration. They provide guidance, right? Besides good clinical practice, the FDA is the one that provides guidances. And the guidances are often vague. And they're vague because I think even they see it as protecting patients from unnecessary risk and harm. But if you unwind this thread, like if that's the foundation, if you unwind this thread and go a little bit further downstream from this foundation, you still come across ethical dilemmas, and we're going to get into some of those here, but they're all due to incentives, and they all stem from incentives and man or woman's quest for hitting their KPIs, key performance indicators. The quote from Nietzsche that applies here is, "The stronger the will, the more freedom one can endure." So these ethical guidelines are necessary to prevent abuses of authority in our space. But obviously, the worst consequence of unethical research practices are harm to patients, right? And it's do no unnecessary harm. And there's actually ethicists in this space, which I'm really glad there are. Although they're just human beings as well, right? They have their own key performance indicators they've got to look out for in their quest to discuss what is ethical and what is not. They also have incentives. So I think this is important to discuss for the industry and important for people to understand, like the macro overview of ethics in research. So clearly it's harm to participants, which leads to like a loss of trust in science and leading to challenges in recruitment and retention. You can argue Tuskegee, which happened multiple decades ago, is still impacting participation of African Americans in studies. Now, because that was like, there's people from that generation still alive today. And so we've got a lot of work to do to recover from that in that particular population of Black Americans. So we're all responsible, not only for us, but for future generations of the researchers, but also patients themselves. And so what we're trying to avoid is a loss of trust in science, because this leads to challenges in recruitment and retention. And you're definitely seeing a loss of trust in science post-COVID. Like vaccines used to not really be debated. Post-COVID, they are very much debated. People are almost 50-50 split on vaccines. I personally think it's more nuanced than that. I'm not going to get into all of that right now. Plus, I don't want to be canceled from YouTube. The Socratic perspective on this is to reflect on the concept of justice and how breaches in ethics violate justice for individuals and societies. You cannot have this industry built on a foundation of sand. You need strong ethical rocks as the foundation. And we got to constantly, as an industry, question the safeguards in place. Because if we just rely on the FDA, well, the FDA is showing you they're vague. If you rely on IRBs, well, the IRBs are showing you they're concerned with being hedge funds. If you leave it to sites are concerned with revenue. If you leave it up to sponsors are concerned with getting their drugs approved. If you leave it up to patients themselves, patients are looking to get better treatment, get better compensation. There's ethical dilemmas everywhere, and that's not going to change, but we should be aware of it as researchers, and as someone watching this video, you should be aware of it as well. So, being afraid of wrongdoing, I think, is important. That's another thing that Plato from The Last Days of Socrates discusses. So, there are 4 core principles of biomedical ethics. Autonomy is one. So autonomy is respect for participants' ability to make informed choices. There's an example of that is participants withdrawing from trials without coercion. This happens all the time. Now, as sites, what are we told to do by sponsors? hey site, we care not only about your recruitment and your enrollment, but also your retention. So in a way, we are incentivized as sites to keep patients in longer than maybe sometimes they want. And I'm a site owner, and we've had patients, telling us, hey, I'm thinking about dropping out. And then we have the incentive to keep them in, so we discuss with them reasons for why they want to drop. So this is where it gets juicy. This is where it gets interesting. Because if a patient wants to get out because of something that they're not feeling well, or maybe they have an adverse event and they're just not comfortable, or maybe it's impacting their quality of life somehow, it's really the PI's responsibility to know that beforehand. Like the first sign of distress that a patient has, even if it's psychological distress, the PI should step in and say, hey, I noticed on your recent survey, or maybe the coordinator should if the PI is busy. That's another topic we'll get into next. It really shouldn't boil down to the patient telling the site, hey, I want to get out. But that's we have to respect their ability to make informed choices. That's their autonomy to do this, right? There's plenty of other examples of autonomy, but I think that's one of the most obvious ones. And there are sites out there that, because again, show me where the incentives are, I will show you the outcomes. There are sites out there, maybe the owners or the PIs have not as strong moral compasses as some of the sites I know and respect. Like, we try to be in that category, but also a lot of the sites that come to SOS, we're concerned about these things. And, making this video is one example of putting this out there, but there's definitely gray area because you do want to keep the patient in, and sometimes the reason they think they want to leave the study is not really correct. But this is where a conversation needs to take place, and you do need to still respect the patient's ability. And if the patient wants to withdraw for no reason, ultimately, as a site, you have to respect that. And it doesn't mean you don't talk to them about how could we help you stay? This data is important. I've been in these situations and sponsors have gone as far as saying the patient doesn't have to continue the study drug, but if they can just continue the study without the study drug and they can be on their current standard of treatment, we'll accept that. You can make compromises there, right? But what you don't want to compromise is the actual respect for their autonomy. And I think that for most of these things, you will see compromise is sometimes necessary, but not when you're compromising core values, and in this case, the 4 core principles of biomedical ethics, which is autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Let's get into the next one, beneficence. Ensuring research benefits outweigh the risks. So, there's many examples of this, but this is typically most common, again, from a patient safety perspective. If a patient is doing well on a standard of treatment, yet they qualify for another study where you have unknown risks and the potential for the patient to not do well, it's not inappropriate to discuss this opportunity with the patient, as long as you're giving them respect for their autonomy. And I think many patients would appreciate alternatives and being aware, but it has to be done in a way where it's not coercion, and you're not taking someone who's doing good and potentially putting them in a situation where they're not going to do good, even if there's a potential that they might do better. And that last part is the tricky part, because you don't know the answer to that last part, even if they have the potential to do better, because it's research. And at the end of the day, we're not even allowed to ethically call it treatments. We have to call it research. And this whole branch of research that I particularly don't agree with, called research as a care option, I think that's a slippery slope towards potentially going against the beneficence principle. So use reason. Socrates would say the best here. Use reason, acting for the greater good of the patient. As long as you don't compromise your ability to use reason and rationale to think of the patient's greater good, and then let them decide, but with your own. I've had PIs not put patients in studies even when the patient wanted to join. They said, you know what, if you really want to join, we'll let you, but I think you're better off with this. And if those are the patients of that physician, they're going to listen to them. We had another patient just text us the other day through Patient Ace saying, hey, and he qualified for the study, and he replied back, I talked to my clinicians at the VA and they don't think it's a good fit for me. Instead of going back and forth and saying, well, why, or try to get into like a rational discussion, I think we need to respect, in my opinion, I'm not saying this is the right way to go, but in my opinion, the rational thing to do was to let him know, hey, we respect that choice. If you ever change your mind or you want to discuss more with your clinicians, here's a link to our website and some of the things that we do. We'd be happy to continue the discussions, but we're not going to push for it just because we have KPIs of getting more patients enrolled. Non-maleficence is the third core principle of biomedical ethics, avoiding harm to participants and maintaining ethical oversight in all trial phases. So this is related to beneficence, but it's non-maleficence. It's do no harm. The beneficence is do no additional harm to the patient. The non-maleficence is do no harm, period. So, and maintaining ethical oversight. So, meaning basically follow good clinical practice and follow the protocol. Now, there's times where following the protocol is not possible, such as in emergency situations, or such as in the patient didn't make it possible, or the coordinator screwed up sometimes. Well, the first thing you do on a deviation, did it affect patient safety? If it did, you're supposed to send that deviation form to the IRB, prove how you remedied the situation, and how you're going to avoid from it happening again. It all has to be documented. This is what CAPA plans. I've done videos on this in the past. Non-maleficence, avoid harm to participants. So, and then proper monitoring of the adverse events. And this is where monitors come in. If you're a monitor, you should be looking, are the sites doing this? Like there could be the issue of negligence here. If the patient came in with like a side effect and it's somewhat related to the drug because it's what's known in the investigator brochure, maybe it's adverse event of special interest, but the site didn't report it and it seems like they're unaware because you might need to reduce the dose or stop the treatment, and they're not doing that, you as a monitor, it's your ethical prerogative to make sure non-maleficence is being upheld by the site. And finally, the fourth core principle of biomedical ethics is justice, equitable selection of participants, and fair distribution of benefits. So this is where payment is involved. So how do you balance coercion versus reimbursing a patient for their time and efforts? I've seen sites err on both sides of the spectrum. I've seen sites not pay patients what they're supposed to, so they can try to nickel and dime and create more margins for themselves. I think it's really foolish. And I've seen sites overpay when it's a very important study and hey, you know what? I know you feel like dropping out, but what if we double your pay your next visit? Would you stay in? These are clearly violating the justice principle of biomedical ethics. And the problem with this one is it's hard to monitor externally. Like, this boils down to insiders doing this for whatever reasons. And sometimes patients themselves will say, hey, I'm not going to do this for $100. I think I should get 150. And then you as a site have an ethical dilemma. Well, they're a perfect patient. We're making a lot of money on this patient. Do we just give them 150, or do we have a conversation with them, or what do we actually do? So that's justice. There's a role here of principal investigator oversight. Now, in my opinion, because I don't believe PIs are usually very involved. Like, they have a reputation for being busy, especially the ones that have their own private practice. They're busy. They don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of the research, but you know what? They keep track of patient safety. They're at least not violating the 4 core principles of biomedical ethics. And most do that. I would say 90% do that. But there's 10% that let greed or negligence, one of those two, get the best of them. And usually it doesn't last very long. It's not sustainable, which is why I think it's important to get into philosophy and understand your bigger why, because your bigger why, which is your career and ultimately your life, is more important than the short-term KPIs. And so, as far as principal investigators are concerned, I feel if they are keeping patients safe and out of unnecessary harm, and doing all they can to do that, and doing all they can to train their staff to do that, then they're doing their job. And I think most monitors would agree with me. And I think monitors' job is to make sure that's happening. And I think coordinators' job is to facilitate and make sure that's happening. So that's my thoughts on PA oversight. Now, informed consent, it's a super important part of research. And you can get into a lot of like little ethical nuances, like, are we allowed to ask patients certain questions before they sign a consent form? Or can we collect a urine drug screen before they sign a consent form? I mean, we know the textbook answers to these. Do we actually follow this in practice? No. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. I think if the 4 pillars of biomedical ethics are upheld, we're getting into like the weeds here, and it's not really the weeds that we should be concerned with. It's the greater principles of keeping patients safe and out of unnecessary harm. But now, if you get into this with an attorney, the attorney's going to tell you, well, someone like Darshan, who I love, he's a SOS panelist, he's going to say something like, well, did they sign the informed consent? No. Do you need to have access to their medical history if they didn't sign the consent form? Well, technically we need it if we're going to pre-screen them properly, but if the patient brings us their medical records, that's one thing. But if the PI tells us to get their medical records from their EHR, that's another thing. And so you get into these micro gray areas all the time. It's very tricky. I don't think anyone really has the answer. But again, your own personal moral compass, your company's moral compass as far as what they allow, and then honoring the 4 core principles of biomedical ethics. So that's my thoughts on informed consent. I think there's a lot with informed consent. Like we've done 40-minute videos on the informed consent. The challenges are vulnerable populations, minors, the elderly, and economically disadvantaged. Most IRBs are pretty clear about this, and there's no real gray area here. The gray area comes from, like the examples I discussed, of patients wanting to get paid more or sites not being honest with the patients about what they're getting paid. Also, you get into things like comprehension and capability to understand what they're getting into, which is clearly, I hope, in most people's eyes, wrong if someone doesn't have a guardian or somebody who's in charge of making decisions for that person. If they're not able to consent, they at least need to assent, informed assent, not consent. And then protecting participants' rights and privacy. Confidentiality and data protection, this is getting super important because you get into little nuances like, well, do we have to redact their medical records if we upload them into whatever system we use? And if you ask certain people, they're going to say yes all the time. If you ask other people, equally informed, equally intelligent, equally experienced, they're going to say no. And if you ask another group, they're going to say, well, it depends. And those are usually the attorneys. So this is another daily occurrence across the industry. How are you keeping the rights and privacy protected? And it could be as simple as, do we redact the document or not? And it could be as random and out of your control as a database hack. So do you let coordinators take their laptops home? Do you let coordinators take patient records home? You as a CRA, do you pull out your cell phone and scan documents, some of them that have protected health information or not? These things happen a lot. I don't have all the answers. I think it's just important to discuss what's correct and what's best practices. And I'm not talking about the textbook answers. I'm talking about us looking at this morally and from the perspective of what our greater role is in this industry, which is to do no harm to patient and to do no unnecessary harm. And I think confidentiality and data protection is going to be even more important going forward as we switch with all these technology tools. Falsifying documents. I read this crazy article a couple months ago about a lot of academic research. So investigator-initiated studies, meaning one PI doing one study, getting a grant, publishing results, hopefully getting good results and getting another grant, right? Their incentive is to get good results. Now, thankfully, I think a lot of them have strong ethics and there are IRBs and such, but it's not that hard to falsify documents to get patients in a study, number one. And number two, it's not that hard to falsify results or fudge the numbers a bit. It happens all the time to show better results of the drug. Now that latter part, private sites like mine, we have no incentive to do that. We have no stake in the drug or the outcome of the drug. That's a lot of sponsors and CROs' actual complaint. But, as far as incentives are concerned, sites have no incentive, private sites such as Yuma Clinical Trials, to falsify the data to show that the drug's better than the placebo. But we do have incentives to falsify data to get patients randomized because we get paid for patients that get randomized. So, not saying it happens frequently or that it's the norm, but I would say this does exist. And all you've got to do is look at warning letters of the FDA where you get negligence or you get like ignoring records and putting the patients in, which is one degree of this. But you get the more insane example of making things up to get patients in. So this goes on a daily basis. We got to discuss the greater implications as an industry. Quote from Nietzsche on this one. Every profound spirit needs a mask. And, this is when it comes in a way, just we're always falsifying something, even if it's something as like how we appear to other people. We have consciousness, we have reason, we have rationale. There's reasons and there is incentives for us to do just about everything. But in the case of clinical research, we have to draw the line somewhere, and I think it's at falsifying data. Like, that's what the foundation of research is built upon, these things. So IRBs are supposed to be the ethical watchdogs for this. So should the CRAs, so should the sponsors, but so should the PIs and the sites. And the incentives are not always congruent with these things. Now, we've discussed all the real life pragmatic examples of this. You can get into more. Sponsors paying sites more than fair market value and then using this as a negotiation tactic against sites. We got to be careful not to use ethics as a weapon. And like I said, we are seeing that with sponsors and the Sunshine Act and arguing with sites as a negotiation tool. We are paying you more than fair market value, as if implying that that's violating some ethics. But that same sponsor is okay with that site enrolling patients as long as they don't have the records for that particular exclusion criteria. That's okay. So we got to be careful not to use ethics as a weapon. And same thing with disgruntled employees. Because if you can find sites guilty of, on a spectrum again, there's no site that's perfectly angelic and run by saints. You can find any ethical dilemmas on, I would say, a daily basis at every busy site. So you got to be careful for disgruntled employees being whistleblowers and trying to stir up something just because they have animosity against their former employer. Happens all the time. Now, there are cases where whistleblowers have witnessed real abuse and real negligence, and they are actually concerned. But that is the exception, not the rule. From my observations, and thankfully it hasn't happened with my site that I'm aware of, but from the stories I hear and things I've read, and most notably it happened with the COVID vaccine with a Pfizer whistleblower that was working at a site, and I actually knew that site owner, and they said, yeah, this was a disgruntled employee, and a lot of the stuff in that sensationalist article was actually, if you knew the industry well, blown out of proportion. But the media and that whistleblower were using ethics as a weapon in that case. And we got to be careful not to use ethics as a weapon. We got to use the Socratic method when possible, all right, as a better tool than using ethics itself for deliberation and reasoned decision making. And I'll end it with a quote from Nietzsche. He who climbs upon the highest mountains laughs at all tragedies, real or imaginary. That's an open-ended quote. To me, the meaning is when you get a high enough perspective of the values and your own personal values, kind of how I started the video with, and how they align with the universe's values, but specifically your company, the organization you work for's values, you laugh at other things, because if you have a high enough perspective, you can see that all these KPIs that we have are loaded with landmines of ethical dilemmas. So hopefully this video helped. It wasn't an easy one to make, and it's definitely not comprehensive, but I tried to make it pragmatic and not just textbook cliche, this is what you're supposed to do. I'm showing you real world examples of how there's dilemmas every day at every company with every person in this space. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Catch you later. Bye-bye. Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.